Historiography is basically the study of historical interpretation that is in the intellectual context of history, studying it from various dimensions from the intellectual approach, but not just studying the narration or the context of history, just going by the reading through the papers, rather looking at it from different angles, like from the colonial approach, how the colonists used to see us, and why they used to settle over here, what was their approach towards history. Nationalist, how we used to see a nation, what was the nation building and all. Marxist, we need to see the labor class, how they movement, and finally how it made the nation. Subaltern approach, and other theories also there which cropped up, like communalist and Cambridge liberal and non-liberal. These feminist interpretations were also there, how the feminists use how the women were dominated in history and how they were influenced, like Sati culture and various other cultures. Colonial approach can basically have two senses. One is definitely the colonial approach towards how the colonization happened and what was the history of the people who settled in that countries and how it happened. Another was basically the ideology behind the colonialism, what was their attraction, what were the real motives and all. Most historians trace their the colonial ideology, and that is forms the basis of their colonial historiography. Colonial officials basically tried to justify the colonial rule, and that was basically the approach of colonial history. That the white man's burden, they tried to prove that the entire burden of educating them, civilizing them, was on the white man. So that was again a psychology behind the colonial writing or colonial historiography, criticizing Indian civilization and culture and using the western counterparts of the western culture. Indians like James Mill, Vincent Smith and Elphinstone, they were basically the examples of colonial historiography. The basic characteristics of colonial historiography was the Orientalist represented India. India represented a stagnant society, and it was the British or white man's burden to culturize, and it was social Darwinism, and the opinion of British that British brought unity to India, that India was bifurcated and India was divided into various castes and classes, but in fact British tried to unify India. Established Pax Britannica, which basically meant that to establish law and order in a society or bickering society. Nationalist historiography or the approach was basically to unify people, develop national feelings and sentiments, not on linguistic basis or class differentiation, but exploitative nature of the colonial rule was brought into limelight, and it through the different movements or national movement, that upcoming of the movement and unifying India, and this approach was developed to confront the colonial approach. Critics of colonialism and give a detailed account of the economic aspects of the Indian rule, how they tried to, like poverty and British rule in India in 1867 by Dadabhai Naoroji, M.G. Ranade and G.V. Joshi, K.T. Telang, Gokhale and Dinesh Wacha, D.E. Wacha. So they accounted for the national movement and national leaders such as Majumdar, Nehru, Patabi Sitaramaya, and this approach saw the international national movement as a struggle between the Indian subjects and definitely their colonial masters. Marxist approach began in India with R.P. Dutt's India Today and A.R. Desai's social background of Indian nationalism. Saw it as a structured bourgeois movement. Class character. Karl Marx, that class movement. Subaltern approach was basically between the elite and the subaltern. The elite did never consist of the British alone, but it was also a separate class of people which were Indians also, but they were elite. The subaltern school never saw the nationalism as a whole, but it was exploitative in nature in terms of caste, gender, religious and creed discrimination on the basis of elite. The elite people were basically the Indians as well as the Britishers. Ajit Guha started the subaltern theory in 1980s. Subaltern school believed Indians were never united, they were never a complete society, there were internal contradictions within the society, they were marginalized. Today also there are several discriminations, or they were divided, the society divided on caste lines, class lines. So there are elite people, within the caste also, and definitely there are some class biases also. Subalterns were the real anti-imperialist stream, whereas there was a bogus national movement of the elite. That was the Congress which they were pointing to. That was bogus national movement. The subalterns divided the entire national movement into two parts. One was led by the Congress, that can be called a bogus movement, which they are calling in terms of the national movement. But again another was subaltern, that was the mass-based movement which was carried forward, and that was against the real anti-imperialist movement. Communalist approach was there, which relied on the medieval times, basically when the Muslim invasion took place and Muslims and Hindus were permanently hostile to each other. Pointed towards the Muslims who had a good story in the medieval times. They were happy and proud of being the ruling class, and the Hindus were dominated, sad and humiliating story. Finally led to communal riots and ultimately partition of India. Bombay School highlighted that Indian nationalism was not a fight between the Indians and the England people, but Britain, but it was the Indians fighting among themselves to seek better opportunities for them from the British rulers. And the leaders were materialistically greedy. They were greed for quest for power and material benefits. Liberals and neoliberal interpreted that the British people in fact invested in India capital and everything in railways and all, and this hindered their own domestic investment, and they got latter development delayed, and new industries could not be set up, and this was not beneficial for the Britishers. Proponents like Patrick O'Brien, Hopkins, and Kane. History, that is writing about women's history, started in 1970s in India, and that broadened and became complex. Supplemented the mainstream history to see how colonial structures like legal structures and how they facilitated the women's life and how they affected the women's. Progressive laws shaped the gender relations. Denial of ownership left the woman in vulnerable position. High caste Hindu woman, 1887, Pandit Ramabai. Mother India, 1927, by Catherine Mayo. Attracted international attention. Nationalist approach Hindu Muslims different interests, mutually different, antagonistic, and are permanently hostile to each other. Cambridge School, conflict between Indians to get the better alternative or better facilities from the British rulers, and Indian nationalist leader had the greed for power and material benefits from them. Basically, Indians were fighting among themselves to get the better opportunity, that who can get the better. Sometimes Hindu fought against the Muslims, like the Syed Ahmad Khan case. So in this way, liberals, neoliberals, economic exploitation was detrimental to English own British interest of development in their own nation. This historiography, how the feminine or the female section was dominated, and the colonial structure never provided them, legal structure never provided them good lives, and they were left in a vulnerable position, not allowed to own anything. Denial of ownership.